السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الأخوة والأخوات الحضور والمشاركين، السادة الخبراء، مرحبا بكم في النسخة الثالثة من 90 دقيقة من المعرفة التربوية لعام 2023، والتي نسعى من خلالها إلى استكشاف استراتيجيات دعم الأنظمة التعليمية لاقتصاد المعرفة. أن اختيارنا لهذا الموضوع ذو الأهمية البالغة يأتي نظراً لإدراكنا لتأثير الاقتصاد المعرفي على تطور الأمم وتقدمها في العصر الحديث. نحن نعرف جميعاً بأن معظم دول العالم تعيش حالياً تحولاً سريعاً نحو اقتصاد المعرفة، حيث يتم تحقيق التقدم والنمو الاقتصادي بواسطة الابتكار وإنتاج المعرفة، ويعتبر الاقتصاد المعرفي محركاً رئيسياً للتنمية الاقتصادية والاجتماعية، ويعزز التنافسية العالمية، ويفتح آفاقاً واسعة للتقدم والازدهار. ويحتاج التحول إلى اقتصاد المعرفة إلى ممكنات كثيرة محددة واستراتيجيات فعالة لضمان تطوير القدرات وتعزيز المهارات اللازمة للفرد والمجتمع لمواكبة هذا التحول نحو هذا النوع من الاقتصاد. ويأتي التعليم في مقدمة هذه الممكنات المحفزة لتحقيق هذا النوع من الاقتصاد، حيث يلعب النظام التعليمي دوراً أساسياً في تطوير وتعزيز الاقتصاد القائم على المعرفة، لأنه ينتج موارد بشرية ماهرة يمكنها التكيف مع الأوقات المتغيرة ومواكبة التطورات في جميع المجالات. فالاقتصاد الذي يستفيد من مهارات ومواهب الموارد البشرية يتصف بالاستدامة والثبات. ولإدراك المركز الإقليمي للتخطيط التربوي أهمية التعليم في دفع عجلة الاقتصاد القائم على المعرفة، والذي تتبناه وتركز عليه دول الخليج العربي في رؤاها واستراتيجياتها الوطنية، فقد قام المركز بتنفيذ دراسة متخصصة لبناء نموذج عملي لقياس الفجوة بين مخرجات الأنظمة التعليمية ومتطلبات اقتصاد المعرفة، وكيفية وضع الآليات والاستراتيجيات اللازمة والمطلوبة لجسر هذه الفجوة. فنحن ندرك بأننا نعمل في منطقة تملك فيها الدول رؤية طموحة تجاه الابتكار والتعليم تعكس التزامها في بناء مستقبل قوي ومستدام. إن تطوير نظام تعليمي داعم لاقتصاد المعرفة يحتاج إلى آليات تحول وتغيير تعمل على أن تصبح الأنظمة التعليمية أنظمة متكيفة ومرنة تركز على التعلم المستمر وتشجع على الابتكار والاستدامة. علاوة على ذلك، ينبغي أن نستخدم التكنولوجيا بشكل فعال لتعزيز العملية التعليمية وتسهيل الوصول إلى المعرفة والموارد التعليمية وتطوير المهارات التقنية، وأن يتماشى تطوير المناهج التعليمية مع احتياجات سوق العمل في اقتصاد المعرفة، مع التركيز على تنمية المهارات الأساسية للطلبة مثل التفكير النقدي وحل المشكلات والابتكار والتعلم المستمر الذاتي، بالإضافة لدعم التعلم العملي، حيث ينبغي أن تشجع الأنظمة التعليمية على توفير فرص تعلم عملية وتطبيقية للطلاب من خلال الدروس العملية والمشاريع البحثية، وفرص التدريب العملي عبر بناء شراكات قوية مع الصناعة والمؤسسات والمجتمع المحلي، بحيث تتيح هذه الشراكات فرص التدريب والتوجيه المهني والاستشارة للطلبة، وتزيد الارتباط بين التعليم وسوق العمل. من خلال تبني هذه الاستراتيجيات وغيرها يمكننا جعل مخرجات الأنظمة التعليمية تتوافق مع متطلبات اقتصاد المعرفة، مما سيسهم في تطوير جيل مؤهل قادر على المساهمة في اقتصاد المعرفة والازدهار المستدام. في الختام، شكراً لكم على حضوركم ومشاركتكم القيمة، ونتطلع إلى نقاش تفاعلي مثمر يثري فهمنا للمفاهيم المتعلقة بالاقتصاد المعرفي ودور التعليم في تحقيقه. ونأمل أن تسهم الاستراتيجيات التي سوف تناقش في هذه الجلسة في تعزيز قدراتنا التعليمية وتمكيننا من مواجهة تحديات المستقبل والاستفادة القصوى من إمكانياتنا من أجل تطوير أنظمة التعليم وبناء جيل مستقبل لهذه الأمة. والآن سوف أترككم مع الدكتور قسيم الشناق، أستاذ مشارك في التربية العملية في قسم المناهج وطرق التدريس في كلية الإمارات للتطوير التربوي. دكتور قسيم خبير دولي في علوم التعلم الإلكتروني والتعلم البيئي والتنمية المستدامة، شغل مناصب أكاديمية في فنلندا والأردن والإمارات العربية المتحدة، يعمل حالياً كأستاذ مشارك في تعليم العلوم في كلية الإمارات للتطوير التربوي، وقد شغل أيضاً مناصب تدريسية وإشرافية في الجامعات والمؤسسات التعليمية. لديه خبرة بحثية وتدريبية، ونشر كثير من الدراسات في مجالات التقييم الوطني والدولي والتعلم الإلكتروني في العلوم والتعلم البيئي. حاصل على الدكتوراه من جامعة ولاية ميشيغان وماجستير من الجامعة الأردنية. تفضل دكتور قسيم، نترك لك الجلسة للإدارة.
شكرا أستاذة مهرة المطوعي. Thank you so much, Your Excellency, Mrs. Mohra Al-Mtaw'i, for your nice word and introductions, and for your thoughtful thinking about this very important topics that our guest speakers and main speakers will discuss today with our audience. Really, I would like to thank the RICEP Center for your kind invitation and for your tackling an important topics that are needed in today's society, especially in the GCC areas, and according to the national agendas of the GCC countries, they are looking to bridge or to align between the outcomes of the education system and the knowledge economy or knowledge-based economy growth. And they are looking to not rely too much on the oil as a main source of revenue. They are looking to maximize the value of education system that contributes to the GDP. Our today's main guest speakers, the Prof. Paulo Cervera. He is the Director of Counseling Services for BNITES. Professor Paulo is an experienced management consultant specializing in startup growth and government planning. He has experts in strategy, innovation management, and future foresight, particularly in the education sector. Currently, he serves as the Director of Counseling Services and Pensat at UAE-based boutique counseling firm, and hold positions as a visiting professor in entrepreneurship and innovation management at RINU institutions in Switzerland, France, and Germany. With a decade of experience, Professor Paulo has successfully executed projects for multinational companies, monitored startups and entrepreneurs, and advice management entities. He holds his MSc in strategy, entrepreneurship, and innovation, along with a BSc in business administration, and has a legal background from his previous studies. The topic of today's 90 minutes of knowledge series that organized by RICEP UNESCO Center, guided by Her Excellency Ms. Mohra Al-Mtaw'i and her team. The title will be Bridging the Gap Between Knowledge Economy Requirements and Education System Outcomes. What are the main features of this and the main titles within this research paper and report? It is a thorough report that I recommend each one of the audience to have a chance to read it through this report. And I think the RICEP Center will maybe share with you this on the chat box, this report. It's good for you to have this. Without further ado, I kindly ask Professor Paulo to present his paper to the audience. Without further ado, Professor Paulo, floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Qasim. Thank you very much for your kind words and for the introduction. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. Well, thank you. I would like to, before I start, to thank Her Excellency Ms. Mara and all the RICEP team for providing the supporting infrastructure for developing this research. It's been, I think, a very interesting journey that we have embraced together in the last years, working on understanding really how to bridge the gap between the knowledge economy requirements and the education systems. And this research is really grounded on the understanding that the education sector is changing, and that the era in which we are living has been changing in the last decade, and probably the education sector in many parts of the world has really been able to cope with this change and to follow this change in where us as researchers and policymakers and education experts in all shapes and forms really believe that education should instead lead the change when it comes to supporting the economic development and the social growth of a country and of a region like the GCC. So during the next 15 or 20 minutes of our time, I will try to walk you through what has been the methodology and the process of coming up with this new model. I think it's important to mention that the model was not created and was not designed with the GCC in mind, but rather was trying to give an international exposure and an international context to a model that would be able to assess knowledge economies, but through the lens of the education system. And so the fact that the model has been then tailored and applied to GCC countries is just an added value of how I would say the GCC have been able to pioneer in this area of research and understand and try to develop something that could be, yes, used on the GCC level, but could potentially even be exported then internationally. And so we will start by discussing a bit more about what's the context about the report and the model developed, and what are the motives behind it, why we felt with ARCEP the need of creating such a model. And then we are going to have a look at what kind of linkage there is between the education system and the knowledge economies, and specifically, what do we actually refer to as knowledge economy. And then we are going to deep dive in the last 3 sections of the presentation into the understanding about what other models that are out there on an international level that are assessing components related to the education and their relationship and their contribution to economic development and social growth. And then we are going to have a look at the newly developed model that we call the KEM, so the knowledge economy model, and what are some of the main findings of the very first application of this model within the GCC countries. So, why have we actually started looking into this subject, and why did we feel the need of understanding what are the contribution of education system to social growth and economic development? So you might think that this sort
Professor Paolo, would you please maximize your screen and put it in the show mode?
Yeah, it's not.
It sounds like part of the screen, not full screen.
Is it better now?
Just we are waiting. We can't see anything now.
Nothing?
Nothing.
All right, let me just try to disconnect from my second screen.
Yeah.
How does it look now?
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Thank you for letting me know. And if there is any trouble technically or with my audio, anything throughout the presentation, please feel free to let me know. So as I was saying, what are the I would say the motives behind the research that we have started to tackle in this report? The value chain that you have in front of you is really might really be familiar, and in fact, this is the kind of a value chain that typically is referred to as supply chain, that is related to a product or a service. But if we really think about it, the education sector is really can be really analyzed in a very similar way. And so we see that learners typically access a number of inputs, and we see how this has been really affected by modern technologies and social trends. So before, the educational inputs were coming from mainly one or two traditional sources, whereas nowadays we have less conventional methodology and sources like YouTube or other platforms like MOOCs and so on. And then they process this kind of information and combine them into a personalized learning map or a personalized learning experience that is auto-generated from them, that then is creating for them a learning output. And then with this learning output, they utilize to have a more tangible result of those competencies by applying them and then generating and acquiring practical knowledge in the labor market. And by doing so, of course, they generate a learning outcome that has an impact in their life first, and then in the surrounding environment they live in. And so the typical way that we look at that are used in the market or in the current research to assess this value chain, this educational value chain, are really the traditional methodology that we see out there. So we can see that we have a way to assess the process that is assessing the transformation of the inputs and the input itself. We see that we have also an assessment of what are the outputs of this process. And then we are trying to assess what are the intended results through an assessment of the outcome and the impact that the educational journey has had on the life of the learners. But what we really want to focus on in this research is how can we do one further step, and how can we try to assess the impact that the overall supply chain of education, or the way we call it in the research, is affecting what we see as the knowledge economy. And so what we see as the social development and economic growth generated solely by the education industry and the education value chain. And so what the knowledge economy what the knowledge economy model has been trying to do is really to identify a model that would be able to assess first the education sector, but with a perspective by looking at the economic and social development of the country, and what are the inferences that we can make between how the education inputs, outputs, and outcomes are generating outputs and impacts on the economic level. And by doing so, trying to bridge the gap on a policy level. So what kind of policies can we generate in order to bridge the gap between what are the requirements of the labor market and the economic growth from a knowledge economy perspective, through an education system that is supporting this growth by generating the most valuable and the most accurate outcomes. And so what we really have tried to answer in this research are four overarching questions. The first one that we have tried to look at is what is the relationship between education and knowledge economies? And I think if we refer to a traditional industry in the 60s, the 70s, and during the first three industrial revolutions, we can really see that there is a direct correlation between the inputs that have been inserted into the country and into any specific sector and the contribution that they have had on an economic and a social development by providing new jobs, by providing new technologies and methodology to process certain inputs into outputs, by opening up the market to different international sectors and living in a, I would say, globalized environment like the one we live today. And so what we want to look at really in the first part is understanding how does now in the new market, in the new economy that we are living, that is always less dependent on physical resources and much more relying instead on intangible assets, this education sector is contributing to the development of this kind of economies. And then what we have started looking at is existing models, and specifically existing models that had education indicators on multiple levels of the supply chain, and how are these indicators currently measured, and what has been the use of the measure of these indicators for policymakers in supporting decision-making processes from a government perspective for the development of the knowledge economy. And then I would say we really looked at to the development part. So the first two components of the research are really focused on understanding what is out there, so doing the traditional literature review, whereas the third part of the model is really trying to have a more focused approach by saying, okay, these are the different resources that we have, and these are the different indicators that we find on a multiple level on different sectors and different environments. And now what if we zoom in and we try to collate all these indicators and these perspectives by looking only at the education and what is the education sector being able to contribute to when it comes to knowledge economy. And then we have applied the research and the model on the GCC countries by having both an individual report and an individual assessment for each of the GCC countries through the application, through the lens of our knowledge economy model, and an overall assessment of GCC compared to other regions of the world and how they've been performing compared to each other. So, what is knowledge economy, and what are the different elements that we really recognize in it? Sorry, there you go. So the important part that we need to recognize and we need to highlight here is the fact that knowledge economy has really been defined and theorized, and also I would say operationalized in many different ways over the last 50 years. And there is not a definitive consensus, of course, but there is a definition that tries to capture its general understanding, and that most notably, which is what we really try to highlight in the report, tries to capture the economic and the social transition that we are experiencing and that affects the role of education in today's society. And so the definition that you can see here, which is the main definition that we have, I would say, centered the research on, describes knowledge economy as the outcome of the evolution of these economies from previous iterations to the information age. And so it's really the latest stage of the development in which we live in an environment, as I was describing before, that is focusing much more on intangible assets and intangible resources rather than capital and labor, which were the more tangible inputs that we saw in the transformation of economies. And so this report that comes from a journal called A Primer on the Knowledge Economy from Victoria University has really been encompassing the transformation that the economy has been going through, and how the contribution of the economic sector has not been able to cope with this economic transition and social development that we have experienced in the last few decades. And of course, on top of this, I would say, more comprehensive definition, there are a number of other definitions that I would say go in a very similar direction. I could mention the OECD definition that defines knowledge economy as a phenomenon that pivots from previous economic areas that were instead prevalently dependent on physical, material, or natural resources for wealth creation, and instead is trying to focus on having a greater dependence on intellectual ability. And not only that, but what the OECD is really focusing on as well is describing knowledge economies as a shift, as almost a trend that is happening in advanced economies and developed countries towards both businesses and markets to have a greater reliance on knowledge, information, high skills level, and really trying to focus on the intangible assets. Another definition that we see in the report as well that I think is worth of mention is the World Bank definition, where the World Bank echoes, I would say, the same positioning of the OECD and Victoria University by stating that a knowledge economy is a key engine of economic growth, and it's an economy where knowledge is acquired, created, disseminated, and then used effectively to enhance economic development. And so we see that these definitions together, they really try to help us in move in transiting from a traditional economic composition like the one we have experienced before the internet transition until 20 years ago to the world in which we live today. So by trying to look at it from a more traditional supply chain, the supply and the value chain of education, but also by changing the factors and of a same equation by inserting something that is knowledge and the more intangible assets like data, like skills, like knowledge, like competencies, and like information access, retention, processing, and distribution. And so now that we have a better understanding of what knowledge economy is and what is the contribution of education within this definition, I think it's interesting to look at how GCC countries have been working in the recent years towards the development of these knowledge economies. And I think it's very interesting to say that all GCC nations are dedicated to closely align their strategic directions and agendas to global goals, such as SDGs. And in fact, what we see is that the transition from an oil dependence to a knowledge economy, it's really at the core, at the center of all GCC countries, and it's really at the core of their plan to become globalized competitors in crucial emerging markets and financial hubs like the one we are experiencing today. And so not only this means that they are trying to meet the SDG targets, so by also working on the Sustainable Development Goals, but it also means that they are trying to achieve the long-term goal of improving the living standards and to support the creation and the growth of middle class based on increased productivity and availability of higher wage jobs. And so by doing that, by trying to achieve this goal, how does education fit into this plan? Well, countries are really leveraging from international development trends that increase their influence and rankings, and which directly impacts the GCC economic growth and long-term sustainable wealth generation potential. So within this context, knowledge economies are really positioned as the next step in that it almost feel like a natural next step for the evolution of economy and social development in the GCC. And at the same time, I would say GCC countries really seek to preserve their traditional culture and civic values, but at the same time, they are trying to include through integrating them into a larger sustainability conversation and in a larger knowledge economy and educational environment conversation that is trying to achieve this goal. Let me mention some of them. I think it's important to see how we see, for example, in the UAE, the Economic Vision 2030, in Saudi, the Vision 2030 or Vision 2040 Oman. How this vision really had a major component focusing on education and skills development and development of knowledge economy. So I would say Oman's Vision 2040, for example, lays the foundation for an empowered knowledge-based society whose members are creative, proud of their identity and culture, and they are committed to their civic duties and values and living dignities. And they continue by saying it should be a society that is endowed with a leading healthcare system, an active lifestyle, and an inclusive education for lifelong learning to develop skills for the future, promote scientific research, and build those national capabilities and achieve economic growth and social well-being. So we really see in the definition per se, what is the stress that Oman in this case has been putting on the development of education infrastructure, but at the same time maintaining a national identity and understanding what are the cultures and the values that the country has been having forever. And so in GCC countries, national and development agendas, I would say education is really described as an empowering force that is creating opportunity for individuals to reach their full potential. And I think this is the very important part that has really impressed us in the research, understanding and highlighting how for all the countries in the GCC, the education is not seen just as an industry to be developed, to provide the right skills, but rather is seen as an opportunity, as a force, as it's called in the Omani vision, that is given to individuals to shape their future. And I think it's by having this in mind that we really need to look at the contribution of education to knowledge economies. And it's here that we really find the power of identifying those gaps that we need to bridge in order to link the education systems to the development of a knowledge economy and to the requirement of the labor market. And so just to mention a few more national agenda, for example, in Saudi Arabia, the Ministry of Economy and Planning positions education in its economic development conversation, and it defines it as human capital development that is conducted toward developing a society characterized by skilled, flexible, and innovative individuals that are nurturing through the quality of education, employment, and broadly accessible lifelong learning opportunities. And I think here instead we look at it, although we see kind of the same flavor in how education can support the social development and economic growth, how Saudi is rather focusing on the innovative part and on the lifelong journey experience that we need to design for the new generation that is coming. And so, whereas in one we have the social component, in one we have the innovative component, if we go to in the UAE, we can see that the United Arab Emirates have really been working on becoming a hub for innovation. And I would say one of the first open labs for experimentation that have tried to embrace the fourth industrial revolution trends and technologies. And so in the UAE, for example, we see how the understanding of these new trends and the adoption of this new technology requires knowledge and skills in advanced science and technology through applied education, through a system that is focusing on innovation and in entrepreneurship. So also looking at the entrepreneurial side of education. And I think for those that are teaching in primary, secondary, and tertiary institutions, we can really experience the transition of the learning methodology that we have had in the last decade or so in the way we deliver the learning experience to the students. I think we have really shifted from the infrastructure in which we are operating to the materials we are using, to the kind of challenges and the kind of questions we receive from our students and from the learners in class. I mean, when I travel to Switzerland or in France to teach to my master students entrepreneurship, I can really see that there has been a transition on many elements. In the last 3 years, I've had students that were above 50, to really indicate how the lifelong learning has been impacting on a daily basis and on a very tangible level. You have people that are trying to upskill themselves or to reskill themselves in an area that was very far from whatever they have been doing for 40 or 50 years. And so I think it's very interesting to look at these micro trends that we experience in the market and understand how these are going to affect in the long term the policy that the countries are going to develop to adapt the education systems experiences, infrastructures, but also the outcomes that we want to generate for the system itself. And so then we have looked, of course, at a number of existing models. And I would say the models that we have really looked at, starting from the left to the right, are European Innovation Scoreboard by the European Commission that has been developed in 2021. We have looked at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development Knowledge Economy Index. Of course, we have looked at OECD sources like Science, Technology, and Industry Scoreboard. Then we looked at the Global Competitiveness Report by the World Economic Forum, as well as the Global Innovation Index and the framework of inclusive growth indicators that was in the APAC area. And I think that none of these frameworks has, I would say, really assessed purely the contribution of education to the creation of knowledge economy, but rather was trying to assess education as part of a wider spectrum of criteria, such as healthcare or social development or economic conditions. For example, in the OECD Science, Technology, Industry Scoreboard, we saw that there was rather a focus on areas like knowledge-based economy or information and communication technologies, or even globalization outputs and impact. Whereas what we really wanted to do is we wanted to have a more focused approach on education. And so I would like to share with you the model that we developed, which is, I think, extremely relevant to the era in which we are living. And I think this is the way we need to look at it, by assessing these not as a static model, but as a dynamic model that is applied in a developing and transitioning time, in which educational learning experience, inputs and outputs that are generated are probably going to be completely different from the one that we are going to see in 10 years from now. And so we structured the model in 7 main pillars that are looking at financial investment and expenditure, so how much government has been putting into as a percentage of the GDP in the education sector. But we also looked at the diversification and the attainment and completion rate, coupled with the quality of education that has been assessed through, for example, international assessment scores, but also skill set of students and graduates. So you will see that there is a mix between qualitative and quantitative data in the way that we have assessed educations in a knowledge economy perspective. And then we looked, of course, at the other spectrum, which is the labor market. And so we have tried to understand how has the education sector supported the development and the characterization of the labor market through, for example, employment status by education or skills level, or hiring and knowledge-based employment, or even education employment status between young adults and adults. And then we have gone into what we call the hard component and the infrastructure component of the model, which are the infrastructure and staff. So technology, infrastructure development, but also teachers as a resource for the education sector. And then governance and regulatory environment, as well as strategic partnership and multicultural, multi-sectoral collaboration that are really the core, I would say, of a modern society and then a modern education system. And so just to close up, in the last minute of my presentation, I think it would be interesting to look at what are the areas that the GCC have been really excelling through our model, and what are the areas that still our GCC countries are performing very well, but are elements that policymakers are currently focusing on to be developed even further. And so if we look at the top of the screen, we see that we have graduates from ICT programs that on average across the GCC states achieve an impressive 46.7% of graduates that have undertaken ICT programs. So this is very important in an economy that is doing more and more towards the digital transformation. But at the same time, we see that the employment of people that have these skills is actually very low. And so the GCC have a proportion of the labor force working in ICT industries and related jobs is only 15.5%, despite the 46.6% of graduates from the same class, from the same skill set group. And so I think this is one of the points we should look at for a better alignment, as well as if we look at school enrollment gender parity at tertiary level, we see that this is the indicator of the ratio between female gross enrollment in tertiary education to male gross enrollment in tertiary education. And so we saw that the score in primary, it's 1.04, and in secondary level is 1, where 1 stands for 50% women and 50% men. And I think this is extremely interesting to see how GCC countries have been able to achieve these scores in the last decade or so. So just to close up, I think GCC countries have really been doing an impressive job when it comes to developing the resources, the infrastructure, as well as working on all the spectrum of the value chain, from input generation to transformation and learning experience to the identification of the right outputs and outcomes to be then inserted into the labor market. And so to diversify from an oil dependency towards the achievement of a knowledge economy. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Dr. Kasim, for your time. I leave the floor for questions and for the next speakers.
Thank you so much, Professor Paolo, for your formative presentation that identify the requirements of knowledge economy growth models and education outcomes, system outcomes, especially in the GCC areas, and your thorough literature review on the modules related to that is really highly appreciated. And you were built in constructing your knowledge economy assessments model on these modules, especially the modules of the World Bank and Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, and other sources really are highly valuable and add value to the richness of your suggested and proposed model. The four main pillars that has been addressed before. By the way, the concept of knowledge economy is not a new concept. It has been addressed since 50 years plus ago. But nowadays, like countries, especially on the development countries, they are trying to maximize the value of education system and connect that to the knowledge economy growth, and to maximize like the employment and to help students who are graduated from different education levels and systems to be aligned to the labor market as much as we can. So the previous module, the focus was in four pillars on the information and communication technology, effective innovation system, a conducive economic and institutional regime, and educated and skilled labor force. However, Professor Paulo built on these like four pillars to create his own module that has 7 pillars, and he explained that in a very formative, representative, graphical representation that focus on the financial investment and expenditure in education at different levels, at the according to our context in UAE, cycle 1, cycle 2, cycle 3, and tertiary, or at the university level. Also attainment and completion rate, students who complete their studies and be ready to be employed, quality of education system. And here, the most important, if you have a chance to read the Professor Paulo paper, inshallah, in the future, like he focused on the international assessment, students' performance in the international assessments as one of the indicators that give us an indication whether our students are ready to compete at the global context, or what we need to be done on this case. The labor force clusterization, resources and staff, the governance and regularity environment, which is one of the important issues, especially in the Arab countries. I think this is one of the pillars that we need to maximize and we need to take care of in order to improve or to bridge the gap between knowledge economy-based economy requirements and the education system outcomes. And finally, he talked about strategic partnerships and multi-sectoral collaboration. And here the most important, to make connections between the industry and the education system's outcomes. We still like suffering from this kind of connection, and we are looking to improve that. We need, as Her Excellency Ms. Mehra Al-Mutawi mentioned, that we need to have highly qualified graduates with their ICT skills, literacy skills, finance skills, as well as numeracy skills. All these skills are the key skeletons of the international assessments. And this is something important that we need to focus on our education system at the country level, at the GCC level, and at the Arab world levels. We will leave Professor Paulo questions till the end. We will give now the floor for our guest speakers to share their ideas about, I'm sure they read thoroughly your paper, and I'm kindly ask our first guest speaker, Dr. Omar Ayyash. He is the president and COO World Trade Center in Kentucky. Dr. Omar Ayyash is an experienced executive in research excellence and innovation management. He has spearheaded innovation and entrepreneurship initiatives in the United Arab Emirates, overseeing system-wide ecosystem development. As he shared with us before we start live presentation, like he was in Abu Dhabi last week and he experienced the hot weather in Abu Dhabi. So he is not shocked right now and he knows exactly what's going on. Previously, he served as the director of the Missouri Office for International Affairs in Brazil, leading successful programs and receiving recognition for immigrant integration efforts. And this is something important that Dr. Ayyash is experienced with. And also he has international background and diverse language skills. Dr. Omar holds advanced degree in business administration and has recognized as a community leader and innovator. So our guest innovator, floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Qasim. Thank you, Your Excellency, Ms. Mahra. Thank you, Professor Paulo, and other distinguished panelists. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. Let me start out by sharing my screen, and then we'll get started. So here it is. Okay.
Yes, I can see your screen and your voice is clear. Go ahead.
Very nice, very nice. So let me start out by congratulating you all on this wonderful study and the focus that you're put forward in terms of knowledge economy and things of that nature. And my perspective that I'm going to bring to you here really is on the ground level, from having lived in the United States, then worked in the United Arab Emirates for a good 12 years as an educator, and then having moved back again recently, the last 18 months in the United States and teaching at two universities, University of Louisville as well as the University of Kentucky, and seeing the experience between the two different places and the region and things of that nature, and how it focuses on a knowledge economy and applying the model that you've talked about. But in order for me to get this going, I'll start out by putting forward a question that I want you to think about for a second, and then I'll talk about it here. And that is the difference between economic growth versus economic development. Countries that are just focused on economic growth have certain qualities, and then countries that are focused on economic development have certain qualities. And in my humble opinion, on the ground level, I feel that the GCC region is really a region that's been focused on economic development, much more so than economic growth. And to put it simply, the key difference is countries that are just focused on economic growth, they're really not worried about the improvement of the economy from a knowledge perspective. They're not looking at raising the level of labor skills. They're not looking at collaborations. A lot of the things that knowledge economy is addressing. And that is the thing that I applaud the GCC countries going forward and seeing that. So when I look back, when I arrived in 2009 in the United Arab Emirates, and we were looking at developing, the student of the future, if you will, it was a traditional mode. We were very much focused, if we were teaching innovation and entrepreneurship, we were very much focused on, how to write a business plan, how to pitch a business idea. But as the time progressed, right around, probably around 2014, 2015, I was very involved with an initiative that the UAE ministry, education ministry with Stanford University was involved in, putting together an innovation entrepreneurship course that really helped the student improve their innovation entrepreneurship mindset. And at that level, you can say there was a major transformation in creating the skills that are needed to help in mainstreaming the education system. And what made it even more interesting is that the course that was developed through the UAE ministry, higher education ministry, as well as Stanford University, was implemented at every public and private university throughout the UAE, and it was mainstream, and it allowed for a whole level of activity to happen. But in reality, just like you've heard from our speakers to start out with, Our kids really need a new system of education for the future that we're going forward. The world of work is changing. You know, in the last 18 months, I have really very seldom spent any time in an office. It was, the idea that students today are need to be in one environment, in one situation, given how the work has changed, has really tremendously has changed. If you recall, a lot of the education system that was started around the Industrial Revolution was very much focused on creating the student that is going to eventually work in a factory or work in an office or things of that nature. So we need to really move forward in that perspective. The most important factor is for future success is creativity. Education needs to be focused on facilitating creativity, innovation, and entrepreneurship. Innovation and entrepreneurship has to be important as literacy and numeracy. Just like we're teaching, you know, how students need to learn, read, and math, we need to really be focused on innovation, entrepreneurship. Students need to love problem solving. Universities need to be an idea lab where students experiment, explore, and create. And we need to teach ideation, validation, and prototyping. One of the things that I was very involved in at the higher colleges of technology in the United Arab Emirates is I moved in my career from being an educator to working in the dean's office, and then eventually working in the innovation entrepreneurship department, where we created the startup development program. And the startup development program was focused on an applied type of education that focuses on not only are we graduating students, but we are graduating companies. And the components of the program was very much focused on entrepreneurship talks, mentorship, inspire and ideate workshops, boot camps, and accelerators. So we took a lot of the activities that were being taught in the curriculum and focused it on applying. And the statistics in front of you show that there was a real impact in terms of how many students were involved in entrepreneurial activities, how many students were involved in startups, how many startups were established, how many startups got their license, and things of that nature. So that's a case study of a real program that really is inspiring our students in the region to move from a traditional curriculum-based education program to a more applied education program. So here's my experience on the ground in terms of the last 15 years or so. I think hybrid entrepreneurship is going to be a strategy that works best for the future, meaning that, you know, students today could start their business while they're going to college. Employees today could have a side hustle and things of that nature. Paulo already talked about this. What fascinates me most about the region is a three-letter word. We're a hub. We're a hub for startups. We're a hub for logistics. We're a hub for international travel. We're a hub now for education. Many people are coming and seeking the GCC country to get their college education and learn new opportunities from that perspective. Another thing that we need to focus on is the startup influences. You know, the person that's starting the business, are they proactive? Are they risk takers? Their particular situation at a point of starting a business, and then other antecedent factors such as gender, religion, family. We need to speak with a growth mindset. And what I mean by that here is lifelong learning. And Paulo was already talking about that, about the students that he's experienced that are in their 50s that are focused on going back and getting more education and things of that nature. But what I want to emphasize here from a cultural perspective is we need to also not only produce doctors and engineers in the Arab world, we need to produce students that are interested in the arts. We need to encourage students to start businesses. We need to encourage students to be interested in a number of different fields that are beyond just a technical field. Another thing that's really important to move the knowledge economy going forward is we need to actually celebrate failure. because failure doesn't necessarily mean that you are not achieving something. Failure means that you are having the opportunity to learn something new. And the thought with that, if you failed in a particular situation, it needs to be celebrated because it means you achieved a level of learning and things of that nature. Educating and inspiring young people to pursue a passion for entrepreneurship is the next step to advancing new business and economic development. So creating knowledge and skills is no longer enough. It is an entrepreneurial mindset and new ventures that future jobs will be created, the national economy will evolve. Developing talent is fundamental task of education, making it essential for educators to prepare future generations. So finally, what I would do here is I would close with, the model that you've talked about in terms of what needs to happen going forward, and some of the recommendations that I would set forward is we need to be less focused on accreditation. We need to be less rigid in that environment. We need to actually hire more professors of practice that are actually coming out of the industry and have experience in that situation. We need to encourage new methods of expanding in that. And we need to really start more master's and PhD programs that are less traditional and more applied. Thank you. And I look forward to your questions later on.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Ayesh. Really, your presentation just highlights main issues in my mind. And the most important that you differentiate between economic growth and economic development, these two different concepts. And you shared with us the most factor for future success in our education system, our economy is creativity. So this means we need to have significant changes in our teaching strategies, curriculum, assessments, practices inside our schools and colleges to focus more about student-centered approaches, constructivist approaches, and to promote critical thinking, problem-solving skills. All are these the most important. Your recommendation for like hybrid entrepreneurship, GCC countries as a hub countries, some Arab countries too, the startup influences, growth mindsets. This is the key issue that here in Emirates College for Advanced Education, now we focus on our postgraduate diploma programs and Master of Education and Innovation to change our prospective teachers, their fixed mindset into like growth mindset. And we try to help them acquire this kind of knowledge and skills that allow them to be implemented inside their classroom. This is the future of our education system. The 3 L's, lifelong learning matters or concept is a crucial issue. Thank you so much for your valuable addition to this symposium. And I think we will have more questions down the road, but for the sake of time, we will move to the second guest speakers. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Rakul Warner. She is an Executive Director, Research Fellow, Non-Residence. Dr. Warner is an experienced educator with over 30 years of diverse educational background. She holds a Doctor of Education from the University of Exeter and has been a prominent figure in higher education in the UAE for 25 years. So this is, of course, this is a very rich experience within UAE context. Dr. Warner is an accomplished researcher, certified emotional intelligence coach. And this is now we need to include this in our education system outcomes, like the emotional perspectives, the students' well-being. All these should be part of our education system's outcomes. And executive training facilitator, while also actively volunteering with charities focused in improving the lives of women and girls. So there's here some bias toward the woman, And we need to improve the quality of life of all humans within our context. She remains an advisory board member for 3 academic institutions in the UAE. Without further ado, Dr. Rakul, floor is yours. Within 7 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Qasim, for that lovely introduction. And I just want to thank RISA UNESCO for hosting this webinar and for inviting me to participate. I also want to congratulate Professor Paulo for this brilliant paper that he and the team have put together. It is refreshing. As Dr. Qasim read in my bio, I've been in the UAE for close to 25 years. And it is very, very refreshing to see that we're not just on the receiving end of these frameworks and metric anymore. We are beginning ourselves to contribute to the knowledge economy. We are beginning to produce data, to produce evidence-based reports like this that can be used in a global context, in a regional context. So I was really delighted to be invited to participate in this. And I'd just like to say congratulations, Your Excellency, Ms. Mahra, for spearheading this kind of program. Allow me just to share my screen, and I will put that on. This concept that we're referring to and that we're talking about today is the concept of knowledge being power. And it is not new, it's not novel. But the idea that knowledge is now monetized, I think that's the new element. And so I've titled, I'm looking at this from perhaps a public administration angle, because that was my most recent placement at the Mohammed bin Rashid School of Government, where I worked for 7 years as the program coordinator for the Master of Public Administration program. So this idea that we have moved into a knowledge economy is it's not new. It is just the way that we've taken to looking at it. But the white paper that has been written supports BCC developmental plans. It actually is looking not just at the countries within the GCC and their educational vision and their educational goals, but their national visions as well. And so if we have this metric that we're able to actually use as a tool to gather data that better informs the policies that support education systems, then this is a win-win for everybody. I think the research questions are well defined, and it's as a result of that why we've had this robust and rigorous set of data that we're going to be able to use and to export, if you would, to other regions, because it is so comprehensive. I think it serves as a scaffold to democratize the metric by which developing countries measure education systems. And we know we can't assume that there is equality and equity, but I think the way the framework is developed, it gives enough of a nuance for the different contexts within the GCC and any country that may choose to use this metric. Now, I want to kind of take us to on a journey to where we came from and where we are and why we're having this conversation. All right, we've evolved from an agrarian people to being on the threshold of what we're referring to as Society 5.0. All right, and this whole concept of the knowledge economy, I think, started within the 20th century. Around about 2010, we started hearing that countries have to develop the human capacity of their people. We started hearing about the fourth industrial revolution. We started seeing how the digital age was emerging and redefining what we understand society to be. And I think from a public administration perspective, when there's an epochal shift in society, it requires an epochal response. And so a white paper of this nature helps us to codify, if you would, the education systems within which we operate, and to actually measure in a tangible way the outputs of that system and how that's going to help us as we emerge into our society 5.0 and as we operate within our information society of the fourth industrial revolution. So I think that the paper provides that impactful contribution where we have very clear guidelines as to what we're looking for in our education systems and how to measure them. Now, one of the things I'd like to say is that we have to be very careful that we're not just counting for counting's sake. All right. So whenever we're going to develop a metric or develop a framework for measuring variables that are not homogeneous, within contexts that are not homogeneous, it's also important for us to think of the qualitative elements. So as this metric is going to be applied, I think policymakers who are going to use this tool will have to also look, what are the elements within this framework, within this assessment model that carry a qualitative component? Many of them lend themselves to quantitative measurement. They lend themselves to data gathering that give us numbers, that give us statistics. But given the environment in which we're working, I think it's important that because of the lack of homogeneity, that there is some element for the qualitative as we apply this metric that we're using. Now, the other thing about the white paper that I really like is that it harkens to this idea of having a qualified workforce being the contributors to a sustainable economy and to economic competitiveness, or to the knowledge economy, which is all about competition. Knowledge is now being seen as a natural resource in the same way as a natural resource, as physical resources. And so what is really critical is for us to capture this essence that the people of a country, and that's what Sheikh Zayed said in the UAE, that the people are the biggest resources within the UAE. And what we're seeing are that many countries like the UAE have adopted this strategy where they're focusing on building the capacity of the human resources within the country so that they can become competitive economically. So education, therefore, becomes the conduit for this. And what we've seen are a number of mega trends that have caused this shift. And I'm proud to say that I've been in the UAE for close to 25 years, and I've seen this shift, as mentioned by Dr. Omar before, that the shift has taken place globally, and the UAE and the GCC countries have not been spared. But what I'm also proud to say is that the growth and the development that we've seen, with the focus on education being the central pillar for this economic development, is actually quite refreshing. And in many developed countries, I might dare say, we've seen a regression in that area. And so now it is so good to see a metric coming out of the UAE, which codifies how within this region, we're able to manage and measure the different indicators that will tell us what are the returns on the investment in education and how can we close the gap between what's happening in terms of education systems outputs and the knowledge economy or knowledge-based economy which we're trying to develop. It also gives us this sense that because of the era in which we're living, where the material conditions for gathering information, creating information, circulating information, using that information, it's changing rapidly. It's not static. And so the other element about the metric is the longitudinal capacity that it has. When we look at some of the indicators on the metric, for example, the financial investment and expenditure, the attainment and completion rates, the quality of education, the labor force characterization, infrastructure and staff, governance and regulatory environments, and the strategic partnerships and multi-sectoral collaboration. These are indicators that are longitudinal, they are agile, they are adaptive. So with whichever context they are being measured in, we're sure
that we're able to use them as a good indicator of not just information, but also a predictive indicator of what needs to be in place to close the gap that we see in our education system outcomes. So putting education at the center of this metric allows societies that are seeking to compete in the knowledge economy to actually accurately measure the outputs from this system. Now, higher education and technical training are obviously assets, but something that I've always said to my students is this knowledge economy does not have lone rangers. People don't work alone in the knowledge economy. And so it's going to be important for education systems to develop the softer skills, the communication skills, the teamwork. These are actually what I call threshold skills for a knowledge-based economy. Yes, technology is a given. Digital understanding, coding, all those things are a given. But the softer skills where people have to work in teams, they have to collaborate across geographic boundaries. They have to understand the emotions, the different personalities that they're working with across different spaces. This is going to be also central to making sure that we can operationalize the effort to close the gap that we're now seeing and trying to measure with this metric that we have. The knowledge economy I'd like to suggest to our audience this afternoon is a performative ideological construct. And we heard from Dr. Paulo, Professor Paulo, about the lifelong learning and the work-based learning and the capacity building that is embedded within the framework. And these are all based on this recognition that knowledge is capital. So we've heard about social capital, we've heard about financial capital. We're now emerging into an era, an epoch, where knowledge is capital. So speed, innovation, utility, and performance are the prevailing currency within this economy. And so if the GCC countries are able to tangibly measure these contributions from its education system, I think we'll be somewhere ahead of the fifth pole. Now, what are the features of the knowledge economy? I won't unpack all of these, but with specific reference to the white paper that we have on the table today, I want to suggest that the knowledge economy is provides a more pluralistic perception of knowledge. There was a time when knowledge only came from the West. There was a time when all the case studies came from Harvard Business Review. There was a time when knowledge was not created from this region. And I think, as I started off saying, this is an example of how this region is contributing to this knowledge economy, this knowledge sharing, this cross-border knowledge sharing, this interdisciplinary problem solving and innovation, competence and skills. This more pluralistic perception of knowledge is actually quite commendable, that we're able to contribute to on the world stage in this way. Now, empirical measurements of this era will require these new frameworks. They'll require ongoing research. They'll require us to be able to put the results in a consumable form like white papers like this. So I want to encourage those in our audience to use this as a model, as an example of identifying where are the gaps and how do we do robust and rigorous research in order to help to close some of that gaps. I think what we're seeing as well is the need for a redefinition of the relationship between education and society. Our governments have put education at the center. I think parents, I think citizens need to also put education at the center. Education should not just be a means to an end. I think education is actually an end in itself, and we have to ensure that there is sustainable access. We have to ensure that we're able to build the capacity of our students so that they can also be part of this knowledge economy. By way of recommendation, I'd like to say that we have to address three central areas in our policies. We have to look at the quality and the access of education in the region. We have to start bridging the skills gap that we're seeing, as mentioned, between the graduates and the labor force. We need to see more alliance between industry, between governments, and between our institutions of learning. And of course, at the coalface, as it were, at the coalface of education are the people who work in the industry. And one of the I think it's often the elephant in the room is the salaries and benefits of the people who work in that space. If we want to incentivize them to improve the education systems, to be the feet that actually deliver these changes, then we have to also look at the policies that regulate the salaries and benefits for these people. So just in summary, if we're going to develop an enabling ecosystem that supports innovation, protects intellectual property rights, encourages lifelong learning, all of these can be very challenging. We have to look at streamlining those bureaucratic processes. My colleague before mentioned the accreditation quagmire that we often find ourselves in, the equivalency. There are bureaucratic processes that sometimes are way behind what we're trying to do with white papers like this. So I think we have to also strengthen the legal frameworks within which the education systems operate and ensure some degree of transparency so we can facilitate the implementation of this metric of the bridging the gap in the Middle East. Thank you very much for your time, and I will give the floor back to our moderator, Dr. Kassem.
Thank you, Dr. Rakul, for your thoughtful recommendations, ideas, and discussions to the main paper. Just I want to highlight two main issues that came out. I found it maybe in addition to what has been shared by our guest speakers, is to focus more in the soft skills in addition to the other skills, whether is it like literacy, numeracy, and other things, the communication, the teamwork, problem-solving skills are important. And in order to maybe make this kind of significant links between development or economy development and education system is to put education system in the center and focus more about the quality of the education system. As you mentioned, like knowledge is a power. In order to have this power, we need to focus more in the quality and the outcomes and the process by itself, the input, the process, and the outputs of our education system. Thank you so much. Our last but not least speakers, Dr. Sadiq Midrij. He's an associate professor of curriculum and teaching methods at Zayed University. Dr. Sadiq specialized in language teaching, and he has extensive experience in professional development, leadership roles, and consultancy work for organizations like UNESCO and the UAE Ministry of Education. His research focus on knowledge-based learning, which is really very strongly related to the topic of today's seminar, and mathematical knowledge, language variables, and teacher adequacy. Without further ado, Dr. Sadiq, floor is yours within maximum 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Professor Kasim. And I would like to thank Her Excellency for the invitation to be part of this seminar. I would like to thank the team who put together all this. I would like to thank and congratulate Professor Paulo for the working paper, very timely and much needed in our work. And I hope that my voice is clear to all.
Yes. We are waiting for the slides if you have slides.
I have my slides on. Hopefully they are there. You can see them.
Not yet.
Okay, let me just try one more time.
If it doesn't work, Dr. Sadiq, you can start with your presentation.
All right. Hopefully.
Now it's coming, yeah. Just put it in the presentation mode, please.
All right. Is it clear now?
Yeah, just make it as a presentation mode, as a slideshow.
All right. Let me just.
It disappears now. Okay, go ahead. You can proceed.
Thank you. Screen for some reason. All right, the agenda for this presentation will include the introduction and the significance, the metrics for knowledge economy, and recommendations for the working paper for Professor Paulo and his team. I'll start with the traditional economy and the knowledge-based economy. As we all know, the traditional economy is based on raw material, based on physical labor, and many developing countries would rely on the traditional economy. However, many developed countries transitioned from the traditional economy to knowledge-based economy. And in this situation, they will rely on the intellectual human capital. The purpose and the significance of this project. We have many countries who are fortunate to have dual economies, which means the dual advantage of the two economies, the traditional one and the knowledge-based economy. Certain countries possess significant reserves of raw material, and they are trying and making effort to transfer from the traditional economy to what we call knowledge-based economy. The working paper used metrics through the literature review. They looked at direct measures and indirect measures. The indirect measures do not meet the requirements for the knowledge economy. They would look at the economy in general, not specifically the knowledge-based economy. These indirect measures include global innovation, global competitiveness, and the human capital index in general. What we are moving towards is direct metrics. The direct metrics for the knowledge economy here would gauge educational systems' contribution to the knowledge economy. And the first metric, or I'm going to call standard, is the institutional governance, which might include in it the financial investment and expenditures. The second standard, which is educational attainment and completion rates, I would like to stress the idea of having multi-literacies instead of one literacy. And I would like to mention here that the global assessments might be behind in dealing with what we have, knowledge economy. We are limited to language and math, and now we have multi-literacies that address so many other subjects and spheres. The quality of education as one of the standards faces some challenges, and this one would be the global assessments for knowledge economy, quantifying the internal and external equality measures, and in addition, quantifying the integrity of the quality results between the many different countries. In standard number 4 and standard number 5, where it deals with employment rates, and here we might just want to consider certification if we are going to quantify the labor force characteristics. We might need to look at the career certifications, and this might add to the working paper. The infrastructure and staffing, you might want to consider developing the impact of education on the subsections. Let's come to the standard 6 that deals with strategic partnerships and multi-sectorial collaborations. This one might need to consider adding clinical partnerships and practice. Professor Omar stressed the need for the practice, professors of practice. We need more strong connections between the education, the curriculum, and the real life experience in the workplace. Scholarships and intellectual property, here I would like to suggest to this one is to add sustainability. With sustainability, we have 3 spheres or 3 aspects. This can be the environment, can be the economy, it can be the social sustainability. And I heard Dr. Ranko talking about the social network, talking about the economic sustainability at the same time by having the link between the curriculum and what is being taught in schools and universities. When it comes to skills that we need to have in the curriculum, we look at countries like Finland, Singapore, Canada, and we see what type of educational system and knowledge-based economy skills that they have for such purpose to reinforce their what we call knowledge-based economy. I found these skills almost common between these knowledge-based economy countries. These include using global education indices, scientific literacy, critical thinking, that also Professor Paulo focused on in the metrics that he has developed. Digital literacy is taking the lead when it comes to advancing what we call knowledge-based economy. Singapore, focusing on the 21st century skills, digital literacy, critical and inventive thinking, and communication. Professor Omar talked about accreditation, how it is behind when it comes, and the same thing with Dr. Rockwell, that accreditation is falling in bureaucracies instead of focusing on innovation and creativity when it comes to quality assurance and when it comes to the curriculum development and curriculum reform. Given the time limitation, I would end my my participation with the focus on the skills in the curriculum that is needed to enforce and support the knowledge economy. Another dimension that we might need to look at is what we call the hidden curriculum, where we look at the morals, we look at ethics, in a world that focuses on the capital gain, focuses on what we call business for the sake of commercializing our enterprises, to have as much gain, as much profit as possible. But at the same time, we need to keep in mind some role for hidden curriculum to enforce values, ethics, dignity. These are issues that sometimes we might just say, these come from home, but they need to come also from the school, from the university, from the curriculum in many ways. And this should not be limited to one subject. It should be across the board through all the subjects as we prepare the graduates for jobs that we don't know the nature of these jobs yet. Thank you again. Dr. Qasim.
Dr. Qasim, are you around
Sorry.
again?
Was muted, so sorry. Again, I repeat myself. I rewind the cassette again back. Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Sadiq Midrij, for your focused presentation and analysis on the knowledge economy performance assessment module that created or invented or designed by Professor Paulo. And you shared some key ideas that I want to highlight and share with others about multidimensional literatures, clinical partnership, research and development, social networking, the link between the curriculum and what is being taught at the school and university level, not to focus on the accreditation, this kind of bureaucracy. Other guest speakers, they highlight the importance of this issue. We don't need to focus on accreditation. We need to focus on entrepreneurship and curriculum. And the same question came from the audience for Dr. Ayash, like we need to include this like innovation and entrepreneurship in our curriculum at different school levels. You shared your analysis between the three like countries, Singapore, Finland, and Canada. They have common in the practice that it is students-centered approaches. They have constructivist like pedagogies, and also they focus on critical thinking, problem solving, financial literacy. All of these were a common shared issue with that. Finally, you end up with the hidden curriculum and to focus more on the values and the soft skills. This is something we need to think about it. Again, here in Emirates College for Advanced Education, we called in order to improve our education system, we need to use what we call signature pedagogies. These pedagogies is highly focused on student-centered approaches and constructivist approaches, including meta-cognition, assessments for learning, dialogic teaching, problem-based learning, inquiry-based learning. all these kind of strategies that we need to be a common practices inside our schools at different levels, at different subjects, as Dr. Sadiq mentioned that. I know we are in run of time. It's 6:04. We passed 6 by 4 minutes. So I will just ask many questions for our keynote speakers and guest speakers, and I will give each one of you 2 minutes. Then after that, I will leave the floor for Ms. Mohra to conclude, say her words, and I will conclude after your responses. The questions that I'm going to ask each one of you, and this is the most important because it's came from the chat too. There is a questions in Arabic or a comments like, what is your evidence? Because your Professor Paulo, you design your module in data-driven assessments. So do you have concrete evidences for that to support how we can bridge the gap between knowledge economy requirements and education system outputs? The many questions that I want each one of you, including the main speakers, to answer: how can the gap between outputs of educational system and the requirements of the knowledge economy be bridged? Please, I know in your recommendation you address all of this issue, but highlights in your response within 2 minutes the main key recommendations for policymakers and for future actions. We will start with the Professor Paulo, please.
Thank you, Dr. Kasim. I think there are two parts of this answer. The first one is the way that we are going to address this gap. And the way, in my opinion, and also based on the research that we have done, is that we should look at the education sector as a dynamic sector that is in evolution right now. We cannot just look at the past as we usually do in research and try to gather the data that we find about, the last 5 years and then project the same data into the future. But we'd rather, we actually need to do a continuous assessment of what are the trends in the market from an educational perspective and from an economy perspective. So only by looking at the future and trying to grasp what are the trends that we can already start experiencing today, but that are going to have a radical effect on the changes that the education system will need to have, we can actually grab and grasp the understanding of how the education sector eventually will have to change. And if there is one, on the other side of the question, if there is one component out of the many criteria that we have assessed throughout the model that I think is extremely relevant, is the collaboration between industry and educational institutions and policymakers. I think based on the research that we have done, this is the point that would eventually support the change and the understanding of which changes the education system will require. Because only through a very tight and very synergic collaboration between the supply of skills, that is the education sector, and the demand of skills, which is the labor market, we can eventually understand in which direction the labor market and the economic, as Omar was saying, development and growth of a country are going to, in which direction they are going. So the network and the collaboration between private sector, public sector, policymakers, and educational institutions is the number one point on which I think educational system should work on.
Thank you, Professor Paulo. Dr. Sadiq, I will start from the opposite side now.
I would think about two major areas or two major dimensions that would be collaboration and conducting research, needs analysis, feasibility studies of what the market needs. And the other component would be clinical experiences, field experiences, because as the candidates, once they are in the field, they might just get perspective about what is needed for the market. They will hear from the employers. The employers would feed to the institution about what they need after they experience having the candidates working with them, and they would report to the institutions through the surveys, through the certain questionnaires that we would like the institution to focus more and more on this and this, on that. So research and the clinical experiences would be the most important dimensions for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I agree with you. Research and development is a key issue. Connections between the private sector, public sectors, and let's have more practitioners inside our schools and universities taking place. And have, I wish, like I'm dreaming to have one of my classes. We are doing at Emirates College for Advanced Education, we have like heavily practicum courses that taking place inside the school. I wish like for College of Engineering, College of Business, like some of their classes delivered inside a factory or inside a company or something similar to that. Thank you so much, Dr. Sadiq. Dr. Rakul, please, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I think we have to look at the governance structures and the regulatory framework within which our educational systems operate. As I mentioned, and I think Dr. Omar mentioned it, there are times when it seems that there's a lag between the reality of what's happening in the world and the governance and the regulatory frameworks that govern the quality within these institutions. And I think there has to be a balance. And so this notion that we are actually now operating in a knowledge economy and not a traditional economy anymore doesn't seem to have been embedded within the governance structures. So there needs to be reform at the governance and regulatory level, which for the moment seem to be putting reins on the degree to which we can innovate, to the degree which we can revise our curricula to actually meet the needs of the knowledge-based economy that we're looking forward to contributing to. So that's my short answer.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Rakul. Of course, revising the curriculum at different levels, at the school level as well as the university levels, revising our programs, not on the aims or the purpose of getting accreditation, no, to make these kind of knowledge, skills, and values part of the ongoing process inside our educational institutions at different levels. Last but not the least, Dr. Omar Ayash, please.
Yeah, I would address it from the four perspectives that we've talked about pretty much here. From one, the perspective of the student, I would say, there's no such a thing as a traditional student right now. You can come back and plug in and plug out as part of your educational career. As for teaching staff, I think the traditional mode of teaching does not work anymore. We are coaches, we are facilitators, we are educators, we are much more than just imparting knowledge to the student. From the university perspective, I continue to emphasize that we shouldn't only focus on the regulatory framework. We should really push the boundaries beyond that. And then the fourth area, which is industry, I really would say that industry needs to be much more involved in the academic settings where not only what you said, Dr. Kasim, the students going into work into a factory, but the factory coming to the university and possibly building a mini factory or a mini lab within our educational institutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a vice versa relationship, Dr. Omar. Okay, I would love our students to be in the factory as well. We need to invite the field to come inside our classrooms. For sure, one size fits all, one teaching strategy, one assessment strategy, one teaching strategy, no more it will work. So we need to think about this seriously. Thank you all for your thoughtful ideas, presentations, analysis, and discussion. Really, I enjoyed coordinating this session and being with an outstanding speakers, including Professor Paulo, Dr. Omar, Dr. Rakul, and Dr. Sadiq. Really, I'm proud of being part of this panelist, and we hope for a future collaboration and networking. And at ECAE, you are more than welcome to visit us to open the doors for this kind of collaboration. I'm going to conclude my moderation for this session. Like it came out maybe more than, I can list more than 30 significant recommendations can be made to contribute to policymakers to improve the outcomes of our education system and to focus on the education by itself for improving and for having high quality outcomes. By this, we can bridge the gap between like knowledge economy requirements and education system, in addition to all your great ideas that you shared with, without having a generous and a respectful honor for this activity. The RECEP Center, under the leadership of this Her Excellency Mohra Al-Mtawi and her team, you are doing a great job. Thank you for inviting us and being part of this panel discussion, and we are looking for future collaboration. Back to you, Ms. Mohra. You are muted.
شكرا دكتور غسيم. I just want to thanks our expert, Dr. Sadiq, Dr. Omar, Dr. Raquel, Paulo. He's one of our team. I would like to thank you all and Dr. Qasim for running the sessions and the input that you give us to improve our work and our papers in the future. I would like to thank all the audience. I know that's a lot of people who's working in education sector now is in vacation, but if they want to enter like this sessions, I think that's mean that they have the interest in education and how they improve their work and their education sector. Thank you everyone. شكرا للجميع لوجودكم ومشاركتكم، ونتمنى أن نشوفكم في جلسات قادمة من 90 دقيقة للمعرفة التربوية. شكرا جميعا.
Thank you all, and please audience, I thank you very much for attending. Please don't forget to enter to the chat. There is an evaluation link. Please go over there and fill your questionnaire. By your feedback, we can improve our future sessions, inshallah. Thank you all and see you in the near future.